Welcome to the Filmlinks Podcast,
a bi-weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 96, Pickford's Power, the First Queen of Hollywood.
Dun, dun,
Ooh,
dun.
we got a subtitle.
Yeah.
We got a subtitle on this one.
She's not like an evil queen or anything. In fact, she did a lot of really good things with her power, but she was kind of like part of that first wave of Hollywood celebrity that was like country famous, world famous, like earth shatteringly, like this is a new kind of fame. Like beforehand, the only kind of people who were that famous were like kings and queens, maybe. Or like world leaders, maybe. Like this
and
is.
Sometimes people didn't even know what those people's faces looked like.
Yeah.
But with the movie stars, like you know who they are. You could see them.
Yeah, this is like a new kind of celebrity. But we're not really looking at it from that angle. It's just an interesting part of this portrait that we're exploring. We're going to be talking more about her work and what she did to influence movies, both in her time and moving forward beyond her time. And what exactly the scope of that time was. So, Jonathan, do you want to kick us off with some of the background on Mary Pickford?
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, before we get into all this stuff, we do want to point out that this topic was chosen by our patrons.
Oh, it was
so
a
thank
poll.
you
Yeah,
to
that's
those
right.
who voted. Yeah,
and
it was
kind
a poll.
it's kind of like a mini extension of the Film de Femme series too.
Yeah, it is. Even though she wasn't necessarily a director, she actually kind
more
of
or less.
She wore some hats that kind of bleed into that role, but never credited as such. So we'll get into all that.
Oh, there's so many hats in the silent era.
Yeah,
both literally and metaphorically.
Yep. So thank you for those who voted. And if you would like to participate in any future polls that get to choose a topic on the podcast, be sure you go check out our Patreon. We'll have more information at the end. And everyone can vote in polls, so it's great. But Mary Pickford herself, I think she was known as America's sweetheart, but the irony is that she was actually born in Canada. So she was born in 1892 as Gladys Louise Smith. Interestingly enough,
off the long history of Canadians and Americans kind of being the same people when it comes to celebrities, but then being very different people when it comes to like governments.
Yeah, there are so many people that I'm always like, oh yeah, I forgot, they're Canadian, they're not actually American.
Yeah.
So she started her acting career around the age of 7 to help support her siblings and her widowed mother. And then eventually her family traveled to the U.S. by rail, performing in small theater shows and stuff like that. And she eventually landed a supporting role on Broadway in a play called The Warrens of Virginia, written by the brother of Cecil B. DeMille. And this is when she started to take on the stage name of Mary Pickford, which are actually two names from somewhere back in her lineage, because someone decided that since she was becoming more popular, that she needed something a little bit more with more punch than Gladys Smith. But she kept it in the family by looking at some of her genealogy and pulling names from that. And then she joined Biograph after she started getting some attention, making films in 1909 after auditioning with D.W. Griffith. And apparently she cut a really hard deal with them, making a lot more than most actors at that point, because she was getting to be a very popular stage actress, and she thought that film was going to kill her stage career. And she was very worried about this. So she demanded something ridiculous for the time. Yeah.
Yeah. And she this kind of like is the first recorded instance of her being like a really savvy, hard lined businesswoman. And she's got a very, very like impressive record of those kinds of moves. And it's kind of what helped boost her to being the top of Hollywood.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, just to give the scope, ironically, film did not kill her stage career. I mean, it kind of did kill her stage career, but not in a way where she floundered out of existence. She obviously became super popular, appearing in 51 films in 1909 alone. And then in 1910, she moved to Los Angeles, where the film business is.
Yeah, and we've talked about that before, how everybody was fleeing out to the West Coast, both for the sunshine needed for the older versions of cameras, which needed just a lot of light to do anything. In fact, the first indoor sets didn't have roofs because they still needed the sun.
Right.
But they also, to avoid like patent companies like Edison and eventually Biograph as well.
Mostly Edison.
Mostly Edison. Blame Edison for a lot of things. But anyway, at this point in time, actors weren't really listed in the credits yet, so you weren't following your favorite actors by name. You were following them by colloquialisms. And so she was often known as the girl with the golden curls, or Blondie Locks, or the Biograph girl, or something along those lines. Which is also a very early instance of hashtag branding, because if this happened in 2010 instead of 1910, she would be hashtag the girl with the golden curls.
Yeah.
And then replace
Fun fact,
some of those
Blondie
digits.
Locks is actually what Justin Bieber first was known as.
Really?
No, I'm just kidding.
Okay. I mean, like, it wouldn't surprise me at all. So and then she started making moves around the industry, essentially raising her value behind the scenes and her value on screen by moving around to whoever would give her the best movies and the best price for her work. So by 1912, she had moved to Universal, or as its predecessor was known, IMP, still run by Carl Laemmle. She also appeared in another Broadway play that year, A Good Little Devil, after which she decided, screw it, I'm going to work exclusively in films. It hadn't killed her popularity. In fact, she was more popular than ever, and she was making more money than ever. So why not? She then went on to sign with Adolf Zucker's Famous Players and Famous Plays, which would eventually become Famous Players Lasky, which you would know nowadays as Paramount Pictures, and actually still has its lot in Hollywood. They had a famous relationship in which they used some kind of like creepy nicknames with each other. Like, she called him like Uncle Zucker, and like he called her like, I don't know, like a little auntie. It's weird. It's weird. It's really, really weird.
Yeah, I feel like the little girl thing only goes so far. Like, once you start bringing that into real life, because she was not a little girl when she was playing most of her little girl roles.
Yeah.
That's a big part of today's discussion.
Yeah, we're going to talk about like why that was popular, and why maybe that led to her star fading faster than other contemporary famous people like Charlie Chaplin. Anyway, by this point, Pickford was also the producer on basically all of her films, controlling nearly every aspect behind and in front of camera. She would help cut the films, if not just cut them herself. She would basically direct and help set design, and she was so powerful.
She had major say in what scripts that she was actually in, too, and what content they had.
She had both the power of contracts, which she could force through on her star power, and then that star power also carried through on set. You didn't argue with the most famous person in America whose mere presence in your movie was going to make it a success. So she had a lot of control. After the popularity of Hearts Adrift in 1914, another Pickford film, she asked for and got another giant raise, which kind of helped elevate her to the claim of the Queen of Hollywood. At this point, actually, there was a Hollywood now. Around by the mid-19-teens, Hollywood could be considered an actual place rather than a loose set of movie colonies around the valleys surrounding Los Angeles. 5 weeks after...
Do you know the history of the term Hollywood? Is that just like the area or the neighborhood?
It was a neighborhood of Los Angeles. And it was... Hollywood is the name of the neighborhood. And that's where it got its big name from being Hollywood, the like neighborhood advertising thing. That's why that sign's on the hill. It's like an advertising ploy from like the middle of the century, and that's why it's called Hollywood. But Hollywood was just the name of the area, and it makes sense. Like if you're familiar with the Los Angeles area, a lot of places are something wood out here. Like there's Brentwood's like right next to Hollywood. and there's Hollywood Hills, Beverly Hills. It all kind of flows together. It just so happens that the Hollywood sign went up, and that area became very, very, very famous.
Yeah, but because at this point we're starting to get some of that that kind of contextual meaning to the word Hollywood that we know of today.
Yeah. But anyway, 5 weeks after the release of Hearts Adrift, another of her movies, Tests of the Storm County, released, and that is what really shot her to the pinnacle of her career. So from 1914 to 1927-ish, I would say her like superstardom really ends with the release of It. Not the creepy clown movie, the movie from the late 1920s starring Clara Bow, which introduced a new kind of female lead into Hollywood, changing the idea of what youth and what femininity and what desirable sexuality was in America at the time, which corresponded with the shifting idea of all those things in the 20s. But anyway, so for like a 13-year span or so, from 1914 to 1917, or to 1927, that's when Mary Pickford is the queen of Hollywood, and starts with Tess of the Storm County. And by now, literally the only person who could even kind of compete with her was Charlie Chaplin, and he was slightly more famous than her. And they both kind of had like reputations for being very controlling of their own art. Chaplin was known as a little more dictatorial, though. Anyway, around
but
this
was
time,
he the great? Okay, I'm sorry.
No, fair. Around 1917, a few years later, this began the series of her little girl films, where she really kind of became like known as the little girl became her like persona. Like she typically played younger characters, and by younger I mean like 12 to 16. With golden curls. It helped that she was short. And she did this kind of with the help of one of her close friends and fellow Hollywood personalities, Frances Marion, who was a very famous writer of her own accord, the first woman to ever win an Oscar for anything other than acting. In fact, she won 2. And she had a very long and storied career. And this is the first of many times that I'm going to plug one of my favorite books, Jonathan, The Girls in the Picture, which is about the friendship between Mary Pickford and Frances Marion. I highly recommend it. It kind of gives you a lot of insight into this realm with some narrative drama thrown in. She used her celebrity for a lot of good things, including helping to sell Liberty bonds during World War I and setting up relief funds after World War I for actors who served in the war but were now poor because they spent all their time in the war rather than working during the World War film boom in America. After 1918, she hit pay negotiation deadlock with Adolf Zucker at Paramount, and then she ended up leaving Famous Players Lasky for First National, another movie studio at the time. But by the next year, she had quit them as well, going with her soon-to-be second husband, Douglas Fairbanks, Charlie Chaplin, and D.W. Griffith, and creating United Artists, which we've talked about on a bonus podcast before, making Pickford the first female studio head ever. And United Artists did their stuff a little differently. They acted more as like a distribution company, which is kind of like the modern idea of what a movie studio is, more than like the golden age idea of what a studio is, kind of giving independent producers a label under which they can release movies to a collection of studios rather than developing stories themselves. And she was one of the only people in that group of 4 to actually consistently make movies under that label moving forward. Chaplin kind of started slowing down. D.W. Griffith flunked out of Hollywood within a few years, and Douglas Fairbanks continued to make pictures, but not at the same rate that Mary Pickford did. And then we hit the 1920s, which is just, like a golden era for her. Douglas Fairbanks and Charlie Chaplin ruled Hollywood. This is when we start to see like Hollywood mansions going up, including Pickfair, which is her and Douglas Fairbanks' mansion, which no longer exists. Unfortunately, somebody tore it down. But it was a very impressive mansion in the Hollywood Hills, known for throwing famous big celebrity bash parties. And that's kind of, another one of the sources of our modern idea of what Hollywood is. And Hollywood celebrity in the 20th century. But unfortunately, sound would eventually come along, and it kind of heralded the end of her acting career. Her first sound film, which we're covering today, called Coquette, and then eventually The Taming of the Shrew, which was made with her soon-to-be ex-husband, Douglas Fairbanks, kind of flopped. They didn't do very well. And we're going to talk, there's a lot of reasons for that, and we're going to talk about why so many, her specifically, and so many other of the more successful silent actors had such trouble transitioning to sound. And ironically, it's not just that they had to talk. But she did make a few more films, but by the early 30s, her acting career was pretty much done. But she would continue on in her role at United Artists and would continue to produce many films all the way through the end of the 1940s. So she was very active all throughout her career, even after sound came along and kind of knocked her off of her pedestal as the queen of acting in Hollywood. But even then, a 17-year tenure as the queen of Hollywood is really impressive. Because after that point, nobody would be that dominant of Hollywood for that long ever again. It's a very quick changing, fast-paced place, and it's impressive that they held on to it for as long as they did. But we're going to look at all of that and all of her skills and all of her attributes through the lens of a handful of films. And what films are those, Jonathan?
Yeah, so we're starting with The Poor Little Rich Girl, or A Poor Little Rich Girl, depending on what you're looking at, from 1917. And our first two films are actually made before the Academy Awards were a thing, which started in 1929. And so we don't really have award information from them, so I don't know if they would have gained awards, but we usually put Academy Awards on here, but you can't have that in your mind for these. So this was directed by Maurice Turner. I'm going to just assume that's how it's said, adapted from a 1913 play by Eleanor Gates. And then up next, we're going to be talking about Sparrows from 1926, directed by William Bodine. And then finally, we'll be talking about Coquette from 1929, directed by Sam Taylor, and for which she won the Best Actress in a Leading Role in the second ever Academy Awards ceremony.
Yeah, and I had some distinct opinions about Coquette, which were not what
Coquette's gonna be fun.
It's not what I expected at all, but
it's very different from the other two.
We'll talk about that when we get to the Coquette section. But for now, let's talk about Poor Little Rich Girl. Jason, take it away.
The Poor Little Rich Girl from 1917. Gwendolyn is a poor little rich girl. She has everything money can buy. Everything, that is, except love. Her parents are too busy socializing or conducting business affairs to attend the raising of their daughter, so that job falls to the strict disciplinarian servants. But Gwen's natural childlike instincts can only be restrained for so long. Soon she embarks on a series of rebellious hijinks through which she tries to reclaim some of her quickly fading childhood. Things take a turn for the worse, however, when Gwen's father loses a big part of his fortune in the stock market crash, and the tyrannical housemaid takes drastic measures to keep Gwen from interfering with her parents' business.
All right, so Poor Little Rich Girl, and man, it's been a while since we've done proper silent films on the podcast, Alex, and I forgot how imaginative they are. Like, especially, this one especially has the most of that, the silent film fantastical filmmaking that just is people experimenting and putting things like pieces of film together and just making it happen in order to create emotion and create scenes and images. And I loved it. And it's mostly towards the back end of this film. And I think that the interesting thing about this film is that it kind of takes a left turn halfway through. It starts off being
Do you mean when she drops acid?
Fun. Yeah, I mean the part where the housekeeper, intentionally or not, almost poisons her to death. And
she goes on a vision quest for the rest of the movie?
Yeah, she has a fever dream about almost Wizard of Oz-ish in the fact that everyone in her life becomes a character in her fever dream. But up to that point, it's all fun and games. It's, she's spoiled. she's kind of spoiled, except for the fact that she doesn't have anyone who actually like cares about her as a person. They're just trying to take care of her and keep her alive so that she can remain in society when she grows up. And so she kind of just runs amok, and she tries to play with the kids and, you know, get her hands dirty and just be a normal kid. And that was all a lot of fun, you know. I feel like those types of stories are even still relevant today, as far as parents trying to make their kids grow up too fast and the kids rebelling against that, until it gets to the point where she almost dies and her father almost commits suicide. And then it's just like, okay, all bets are off at this point.
Yeah. No, it gets weird. You start off thinking it's going to be a really simple story about
comedy. Yeah.
Honestly, like this comedic thing, it seems like maybe a bit of a spoiled rich girl not getting her way with her parents all the time. Honestly, probably being emotionally neglected by both of them as well. Although that's a term that maybe didn't exist in 1917, but was still being explored in this film.
But the inner titles, I love the inner titles in Poor Little Rich Girl and Sparrows because they're so commanding. Like the one where the servants come in and the inner titles are like, the servants who are masters by disposition but servants by position, and then all the servants come in and they're really strict and they're mean and they're like keeping her in her place, and nobody has like an ounce of compassion for her. So these are like, this is still an era of filmmaking that is coming almost directly out of theater, except you're coming out of theater without the help of vocal intonation. So all the visuals and the inner titles and stuff have to be like over the top in order to convey the emotion that they want. We hadn't really discovered nuance in film yet, which sometimes creates for really great moments and sometimes just feels like really heavy-handed.
Certainly. Also, I'm still like a little... Sorry, I just can't stop thinking about the donkey.
The donkey, or when the
it appeared in a dream to me last night, Jonathan, and it tried to kill me.
Yeah, it honestly made me think. I can't believe I've referenced this so many times on the podcast, but it made me think of Midsummer Night's Dream when Tatiana turns Bottom into an ass, which is just Shakespeare being brilliant. But there's also the part where the housekeeper like turns into this really evil snake thing, and like there are some really trippy visuals in this. And then there's a literal personification of death that's like the ghost of Christmas Future, and then there's the other little angel sprite thing that guides her back towards life once her parents become involved. There is so much stuff that happens towards the end of the film because there's almost no fantasy stuff at the beginning of the film, except for the point where the father considers suicide, and then
double
he
exposure film.
Yeah, which I thought was really cool because so they have the moment where the father he's lost all his money, and he sees this kind of vision of himself in the chair opposite him, pointing a gun to his head, but then Mary Pickford comes in and he turns back towards her, and then the vision fades, which I thought was a really nice kind of subtle way to show that she makes him forget these suicidal thoughts, and then he dismisses her in like the next 2 minutes. But it's still like all these techniques. I just love this type of filmmaking in the silent film era.
Yeah, they weren't doing rear projection either when they did a driving sequence in this film. They just did more double exposure, where they exposed a shot of the road, and then they exposed again with Mary Pickford and her nanny? Was it her nanny who was in the car with her?
I don't know. There were so many servants, I didn't really know what they all did.
I don't remember if it was a car or a carriage. Like, it's that weird point in time where it could be either, and it would make sense. Yeah. But yes, we should also mention, Jonathan, that Poor Little Rich Girl is the film that launched her little girl persona. So did it throw you off having a clearly adult woman who was short but still clearly adult play a little girl in this film?
Not too much. I think that the makeup and the costuming help a lot. And granted, she's 10 years younger than she will be in the next film when she's still playing kind of a little girl. It's a little more vague in the next film. But I thought that she did a really good job, especially, I mean, this is one of the things that made her stars. Her close-ups are so expressive, and the way that she's
very good at emoting in silence.
Yeah, be very specific with her facial expression and her eyes and her mouth. And I think that fits really well into this kind of persona, and she had it kind of nailed down at this point. But her close-ups really do show you those kind of, the silent film acting chops where you still have to be theatrical and big. And I don't know too much about the details of like what the quality of the film would have been at the time that anyone would have seen it, because I know nowadays with film prints, you can extract a very high quality copy from them, but I don't know that that's how people were actually seeing them at the time, just being projected. So you have to still be big because you're going to be fighting the grain and the contrast and all that of the film and the projection, and there's so many variables. So there's still a very theatrical quality to the acting, but Mary Pickford knows how to give it in just the right amounts. Yeah.
And I mean, there is still a lot of gauze on those close-ups. It shows up, I think, more the farther you get into her career, which makes sense because it tends to track with the age of an actor or actress. And
they could be more specific about the lighting as you go on. Like, technically, the earlier you go, the more light just had to be blasted at the actor, like to dangerous levels. There were lights in early Hollywood that would literally blind actors and make their eyes all puffy, and like they would have to take a day off just so that they could see again.
Look like
and
a human
act
again too. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so I was like, nice. I was feeling that in some of her close-ups because you could see the highlights were way more intense than, today you could throw up a cell phone and have an highlight. We haven't talked about highlights before, Alex. You want to get a little technical?
About eye highlights?
Yeah, just highlights. Just the idea that if, and this is a generalization, there are times to break this rule, but in general, when you're filming somebody, if they don't have any little reflection of light in their eyes, then they feel off. If they feel kind of dead or evil or something like that. And so whenever you're filming, you want to be able to see a little glint of light in the actor's eye. But in this film, there's so much of it because there's so high-powered lights that I was like, Mary Pickford, your close-ups are great, and I feel very bad for you because I don't know what you're going through in that moment. The fact that you can act through that is kind of amazing.
Yeah. I mean, even those, aren't they called Klieg tears too, where you have to look into the light to make yourself cry as an actor?
Yeah, I don't know all the techniques of crying, but that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I mean, you're seeing a lot of like the development of camera acting and camera lighting in these films. Mm-hmm. So it's really interesting to see it refined.
And she got a lot of physical comedy in this movie too.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of, the structure of these silent films tends to follow essentially a series of vignettes, and think like a bunch of short silent films, just kind of strung together about the same character that progresses them slightly along the story. And a lot of them, especially early on, are very, very comedic. Her playing with the organ grinder in the house, her playing outside in the mud.
When she breaks the sink, that was like a whole 10 minutes of her just trying to stop the water. But it was just in this really contained little set with one sink and a bathtub and the pipe, and there's just water going everywhere, and she's just kind of playing with it. I wouldn't be surprised if that whole sequence is improvised.
Yeah, no, me neither. I mean, there's scenarios, but maybe not necessarily scripts at this point. So a lot of it's just what feels natural. And I mean, of course, Mary Pickford is well versed in her craft, even by this point in her career. And she
started when she was 7.
Yeah. I mean, she's one of the first instances of people who just seem to crackle on camera, right? Mm-hmm. Like there's a lot of pouring through like books about old Hollywood and what makes somebody good as an actor or not. A lot of them just have a certain quality on camera and understand how things look on the camera versus in reality to make them pop or feel a certain way. And Mary Pickford is one of those people who can interpret things in that manner. So whether it's her doing comedy or like physical comedy, and there's a lot of physical comedy early on, falling in mud, like that tells you a lot about her as an actress, that even though she's the queen of Hollywood, she's willing to jump around in mud, which is not something that would happen on a movie by like a major actress between then and like maybe the 70s or 80s after the collapse of the studio system. Like a studio groomed actress would not do that. So it says a lot about her willing to break rules, willing to play. She cross-dresses in this film. She cross-dresses in a lot of her movies. Charlie Chaplin does too. Like, it's just, I think was a popular thing in vaudeville, which seemed to leak its way into early film quite a bit. It kind of, I don't know, Jonathan. I just like looking at this and seeing Mary Pickford's expertise and her using all of her. She has a lot of power, but she uses all of it to work in a way that's different than your typical idea of a Hollywood leading lady. And she alters it in such a way to make the product, make the story, make the film better.
Yeah. And I mean, she's basically setting the standard at this point. It's so early and she's so popular that all the other actresses are looking towards her and they're trying to figure out what's she doing, how is she acting, how is she getting this across. And she's kind of, leading the forefront. So everything coming after that is, it's an evolution, but also a derivation to some extent or another, I'm sure.
Yeah. Do we have anything else to say about Poor Little Rich Girl? Besides the fact that it's way more acid trippy than any other movie that would come out for like the next 40 or 50 years.
I'm trying to think of, like, Destiny was pretty trippy, but that's literally a fantasy film.
Yeah.
This is a drama that just happens to have
I think
30 to 45 minutes of fantasy sequence.
I think the best way to explain this, Jonathan, and to consider what we call like the advent of like weird cinema around the time you're seeing all those mid-century new wave movements and stuff that's out of the box, stuff that's experimental, is that was breaking of a status quo, but that's breaking of a status quo that was arrived at through experimentation. And this is that experimentation that got there. So there is no status quo at this point. Therefore, everything falls outside of the status quo. This is all experimentation. This is all, we're trying to figure it out. Let's do this. That's weird. Oh, well, is it really weird? Because we do all sorts of weird stuff all the time. There is no norm. And movie audiences are also more open to it at this point in time, with everything being led more by actors and individuals than by a top-down, streamlined, regulated studio system.
Yeah. And at this point, there weren't as many, because nowadays, Hollywood pretty much knows what's going to sell and what's not. And,
do they though, Jonathan? Well, I feel like they've lost that.
Okay. Let me clarify. They know what has sold and what hasn't sold.
Yes. Okay.
And so they copy what has sold until somebody manages to break out of a side of the box.
Star Wars?
And then if that sells, they'll copy that. And so they just keep, in a way, one of my textbooks described it, is called the Law of Hollywood Inertia. Hollywood will copy anything that has sold until something sells better, and then they'll copy that. But at this point in Hollywood's history, there's still a business engine, but there's not so much data yet. So they're still learning what is going to sell right, and their technology is advancing and all that kind of stuff. So a lot of our kind of conceptions about the ways that Hollywood is thinking about what they're trying to sell are a little bit different. Right now, they know Mary Pickford sells. They don't maybe necessarily know what to put in a movie that will make it sell, but they know who to put in a movie to make it sell. And that's why we're talking about Mary Pickford today.
Yeah. And Mary Pickford quickly became that person too, right? Like she quickly had her own studio. Like by the year after Poor Little Rich Girl came out, she had her own studio. And she was that person. She knew she could sell. So she could essentially do, kind of more or less just whatever she wanted. She had she could put the green light up on herself, and whatever she did worked because it was her doing it. So that's just the kind of control that I don't think anyone has ever had in Hollywood before or since. That's crazy to be the trendsetter, the big star, and the person with the money all rolled into one. That's absurd. Yeah. So we're seeing crazy levels of power and what you can do with it here.
Yeah, because the industry is so small at this point that, especially as a leading lady, she is kind of the pick of the crop. Nowadays there are big actors and actresses, but there are a good number of them. So it's not like one person is going to make or break a movie, because you could probably find someone else that you can put in there, and it would be different, of course, but it's not like if we don't have Mary Pickford, we're not going to make a successful movie. At this point, she has so much power, even over the male actors, because there are more male actors than there were female actors that had this level of popularity. It's just crazy.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Her and her husband at the time, Douglas Fairbanks, never really appeared in very many movies together. In fact, they didn't really start doing it. I think they did it once early on, and then they did it like a second time. But that was The Taming of the Shrew, and that was kind of like when their marriage and their careers were failing. So it was kind of like
that's ironic.
That's like a last gasp, like attempt to save a sinking ship by combining what was left of their star power at the time, which is sad in a way, but also weirdly appropriate because it was The Taming of the Shrew.
I know, right?
So yes. We kind of veered into general, but let's move on.
I know, we're like way in general.
To Sparrows, 1926. Jason, take it away.
Sparrows from 1926. Set in a gothic southern swampland, Sparrows tells the tale of a group of children being looked after by the mean and greedy Mr. Grimes, whose only motivation is the foster checks he receives for each of them. The oldest of the children is named Molly, who gets thrust into the role of keeping the other children safe from the swamp, illness, and most of all, Mr. Grimes. But when Mr. Grimes and his compatriots kidnap the child of a rich family for ransom and then fear that the law is hot on their trail, Molly realizes she must either brave death at the hands of the swamp or the hands of Mr. Grimes.
Hey, Jonathan.
Hey, Alex.
What'd you think of Sparrows?
I thought Oliver Twist.
You thought Oliver Twist. You know what? I could see it. It's very Dickens-esque. It's got a bunch of orphans.
Very Dickensy.
They're all
it's so
Dickensian.
Stark.
There's a term for it.
Dickensian. It literally starts with the title. The devil created this swampland and he put Mr. Grimes in it, or something to that effect. And so literally we're starting off with, we're in some swampland in the South with this really evil guy who is literally taking children from parents who can't afford to have them, getting their foster checks or however it worked back then, and not taking care of the children, literally selling them to other farmers or pushing them in the swamp.
To kill them.
How many times does he threaten to push people in the swamp, Alex? It's like Chekhov's
like every scene he's
hole.
in. I mean, they literally, like, I like this sequence. Might be one of my favorite sequences in any short film I've ever seen, and it's the introduction of this character where he's like walking through the spooky woods and swamp in like a wide shot, which is an incredible shot.
All the like overhanging trees. Like this definitely takes place in Louisiana, even though they don't say it. But I mean, it's gotta be it's like a bayou.
Well, really, Jonathan, real quick, just for a little bit of trivia tidbit, this exists on a set on a back lot in Hollywood that was 3 acres large. It was made into a full swamp. All of the children on the movie were given free reign of the set so that they could run around and essentially develop like the natural movement in the area. They were also each given a handler who was in charge of pulling the child out of the swamp, which was basically an actual swamp, when they got stuck, and then cleaning them off before their next scene, so they could be re-dirtied, which is absurd. Like, also, that sounds like a terrible job. I would hate that job so much. I would. There's nothing you could do to get me to do that job.
Or the handler, because I would do the kid's job.
Yeah, the handler. Being in charge of, like, just letting a kid get dirty and then, like, picking that kid up and cleaning that kid. Specifically, which I know that feels like the job of a parent. But this is, like, specifically, like, in, like, a privileged paid situation for both the kid and you are subordinate to the kid in this situation, and that sucks. That makes it impossible. I feel so bad for them. There's also quite a bit of tension between Mary Pickford and the director on this movie. Not that any director on a Pickford movie had a lot of power.
Which has got to cause tension just from the get-go.
Oh, for sure. For sure. Whenever the actor's really in charge, there's some tension. Essentially, the role is just somebody behind the camera looking through the lens to double check and make sure that what the real director's getting is what they think they're getting is what they're getting. But essentially, the director wanted to use a real baby when they're running through the swamp and Mary Pickford's carrying the baby near the alligator. And Mary Pickford wanted to use a doll, and they ended up actually using a real baby.
God.
And the alligators are real, and they're not double exposed. They're just there near all of the people.
Wait, even the one where they're climbing over the branch?
Yes.
No, that was double exposed. Alex, that had to be double exposed.
Yep.
That is not... There were no liability forms in 1926?
No, there weren't. That's what we're trying to get across. This was the wild, wild west of Hollywood, man. Dumb stuff was done. And, like, basically, 10... what was it, 12 years later? Like... 13 years later, Bringing Up Baby did, like, all the leopard stuff, but they did it, like, in a super safe way.
Oh, yeah, that was all fake. Yeah. With the glass and all that. The
glass and stuff. But in this one, they essentially just had the alligators there and then, like, tied their mouth shut.
Oh, my gosh.
Which is kind of an effective technique, because random piece of trivia that I know because I used to watch Crocodile Hunter a lot when I was a kid. Alligator has almost no muscles for opening their jaw. All of their muscles are dedicated in their jaw area are dedicated to closing the jaw. So if you're God forbid, but if you happen to find yourself wrestling an alligator and you can get the alligator's mouth closed and you can get your arm or your hand around it, you can probably keep it shut. And that's probably your best bet for keeping yourself safe, other than getting away, like running away.
All right, but aside from alligators, before we get to the end, because this also has a pretty intense ending in a different way than Poor Little Rich Girl did. But let's talk about the beginning, because the beginning is just creating sympathy. It's just like sympathy, 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 sympathy. We have the evil master who not only neglects the children and takes their foster checks.
He even tossed the doll in the swamp.
Threw the doll in the swamp, which shows us that the swamp is dangerous. And then the other farmer comes... Yeah, the other farmer comes and drops a barrel in there, and they're like, there's no end to this. So, like, we're building up the fact that this swamp hole is very dangerous. And then he sells one of the kids to the other farmer, and then the little baby gets sick, and they do nothing to help it, and he literally gets taken up in the arms of Jesus in the primary fantasy sequence in this film. And then they kidnap another baby, like flipping Raising Arizona or something. Beautiful little baby, by the way, with the curly hair. Looks just like a Cabbage Patch doll. I don't know how they got that baby. But they steal this baby that now Mary Pickford has to take care of, along with her 8 other
You're right. They
foster
do not
children.
cover how they get the baby.
They do. They show the accomplices climbing in through the window of the big German expressionist house and taking her out.
Right.
Or at least they show the maid coming in and seeing a ladder up to the window and the baby gone. So they literally climb in through the window and steal the baby, just like Raising Arizona. And then, so we've got all this sympathy being built up. And then we find out that Mr. Grimes legitimately just wants to kill Molly. That's Mary Pickford's character. he wants to push her in the swamp until she drowns in the bog hole or whatever it is. And then he traps her at the top of the little barn where they all have to hide when someone else comes. And then, so at this point, like, we feel really bad for her. Mary Pickford has gotten to do all of her close-ups and her really sad eyes and pleading for the children and trying to get something. She's so good at
getting sympathy from the audience.
Oh my gosh,
which is so key to like her career being so big, right? Like, you want to like, you don't just feel bad for her, like you want to protect her, which automatically makes you engage with the audience, which is why her little girl persona is so effective, because it makes everybody feel like a big brother, big sister, parent, friends, anybody who wants to protect this little girl who is suffering.
That's my question, Alex, is her age is really vague in this movie. She's 10 years older than the last film that we watched in real life. But all the children seem like they're, 5 to 7 years younger than she is, but it's not really clear how old she is or why she's been there for so long.
I think they did a better job of casting the fellow children in Poor Little Rich Girl than in this one. Not that the ones in Sparrows are like bad actors or anything. It's just that the ones in Poor Little Rich Girl are clearly young, but just so happen to be taller. And so Mary Pickford is about the same size as everybody else on set. Which makes her blend in as a child quite a bit more. But in this one, all of the kids are so small compared to Mary Pickford that she sticks out as like a adult woman playing a kid in this one. And like you can kind of get away with her being like the teenage sister who's just been stuck here forever and is so like a little taller than everybody else. But it still feels a little weird.
To me, it kind of worked because I was thinking Wendy and the Lost Boys. That's kind of the tone that it starts to give off. And so, like, it kind of works, but I just wasn't really sure what the intention was. And the fact that they leave it vague kind of helps because they don't try to explain it, and so you're not really stumbling over it. But she becomes the interceder for everyone, which doesn't work at all. But she becomes the protector, and eventually, when we get to the second part of the film, which is way more exciting to talk about, because it literally goes from like Shawshank Redemption escape to police shootout. After they try to escape Mr. Grimes through the dangers of the swamp, which is by far the most exciting part of the movie. And I was, at that point, there's only an hour and a half movie, but like by the time we had gone through all the sympathy stuff and then they started to escape, I was like, how much more are we going to put in this movie? Like there's a lot jammed in there.
Oh yeah, no, that kind of, a lot of silent films kind of feel that way. And it's important to note that, the 3-act structure as done by Hollywood is very unique to Hollywood. It's not the standard play structure, which you would think is where it comes from. Plays tend to be structured around 5 acts or like 1 act. And so you're kind of, again, seeing Hollywood trying to figure out what the hell a freaking 3-act structure is, how to keep an audience engaged over the course of the film.
We've seen 5-act silent films.
Yeah.
And they're starting to trim those down.
Yeah.
Because they realize that sitting in a dark theater is different.
Yeah, in both Poor Little Rich Girl and Sparrows, it fits in essentially 2 acts, and you can kind of break it down.
It seems like it, yeah.
Poor Little Rich Girl, it's childish escapades. Then the break is she drinks the laudanum, and then the second act is her acid trip, and then in Sparrows, it's her protecting the kids, then her escaping with the kids through the swamp. And there's 2 totally different tones. And in the version of Sparrows I happen to watch, there's 2 totally different tints as well on the film.
Yellow and green?
Yep. And then like the Jesus dream sequence in the barn is like especially golden.
It's all yellow, yeah.
Yeah. And we start to see that change a little bit towards the end of the silent era, and it really starts to figure itself out by the time we reach the 30s with sound. But here they're still kind of playing with it, and it still is kind of very much like a series of vignettes that happen to be broken into 2 fairly discernible acts.
This one had more of a consistent storyline. I didn't feel it was as vignette-y as the Poor Little Rich Girl.
It's true.
Because you've got Mr. Grimes doing all of his criminal activity going alongside Mary Pickford, and then it all culminates with her escaping. Yeah, but that sequence of them escaping through the swamp is awesome, and we talked about the set and everything. But then we get to the police chase part, which is crazy, because Mary Pickford and all the kids, like, hide out on this boat, and then the bandits get in the same boat, and they're running away from the police, and then they have this sequence of miniatures with these little toy boats in a tank, and it was adorable. And again, I don't know how well it would have come off to the audience at the time, but I thought it was hilarious. I love kind of those types of miniature techniques and stuff like that, even when you can see it really obviously, like in this movie. But I mean, at this point in Hollywood, they were still working on their they couldn't actually put their gigantic cameras on a boat and go film it. So you got to cut them a little bit of slack.
Okay, fine. A little bit of slack has been cut.
And then we get a really warm and fuzzy ending. I liked the ending just because.
Oh yeah, no,
it
super
was so
Hollywood
happy.
ending, and I think this is familiar to especially the first two movies, a little bit with the third, but the tone of these movies are there's big stakes, like the little girl could die in Poor Little Rich Girl, and in Sparrows, like these kids could die, but the tone feels a little saccharine in places, and it feels very much skewed to like the popular push for morals at this time, like what like the Catholic League trying to censor movies would be looking to go against. And Mary Pickford also has kind of that built into her brand, right? Like she's all ages, she's PG safe, or even she's not even just PG, she's like G safe, for all ages. And in this one and Poor Little Rich Girl, very, very similar. Coquette, I think maybe not so much.
Yeah, and we'll get to that in a second. But I think for this one, the really saccharine ending worked because I was already in a Dickensian mindset, and especially Oliver Twist, which does the same thing, where it starts off so dark and builds so much sympathy for Oliver Twist, and everything goes wrong, and then you have to flip it, and you go just as hard the other direction by the end, so that everything comes out perfectly for him. And that's kind of what happens here with like I don't know what happened to the guy's wife whose baby gets stolen. They never really explain that as far as I could tell. But he ends up like adopting all of the kids and all that stuff and gets super excited. So, it just like everything wraps up with a nice little bow on the end, which felt right for this movie given how dark it starts.
Yeah, no, for sure. And at this point, like audiences like the happy ending, and they're not like sick of the happy ending in any sort of way, as they would become later in the 20th century. Which ironically,
like in 1929 for the next movie.
And that's funny too, right? Like the 50s and 60s and 70s roll around and people start to go, whoa, screw the happy Hollywood ending. We want sad endings. And, here's Hollywood this entire time making like a bunch of movies with sad endings.
Yeah.
But
check out our American New Wave episode.
Like Public Enemy or like a bunch of gangster movies which require the gangster to die in the end because of censorship. And ironically enough,
there was even a Scarface in the 20s, right?
Oh yeah, directed by Howard Hawks, produced by what's his name? The really, really famous rich guy who was weird and afraid of germs, and played by Leonardo DiCaprio.
Oh,
Howard Hughes.
Howard Hughes.
Produced by Howard Hughes.
The other Howard.
Yep, Howard. Two Howards. They. And the weird thing is, nowadays, Jonathan, we've been on like a sad ending kick for so long. I wouldn't be surprised if we get to the point where we're like, hey, let's get on the happy ending kick again. Which, honestly, I've kind of seen from an auteur director already this year. Have you seen Quentin Tarantino's newest movie, Jonathan?
I have, absolutely. Yeah,
because we talked about it's kind of a movie that takes all of the doom and gloom, like pessimism in mainstream culture these days. All the characters must die. Game of Thrones, Walking Dead. Anybody can die 70s. At any time. Which started way back is essentially started as a bunch of waves of movements coming off of World War II, right? They built up to the American New Wave in America, and then moved.
Which is
when
TV Once
shows,
Upon a Time in Hollywood is set.
Yeah, and then TV shows started killing off all their characters, making it so that anybody could die at any time, and then it became people were upset if people didn't die, like, oh man, that character has plot armor, they're never gonna die, that's not realistic. And then along comes Quentin Tarantino, he's like, you know what if we have a happy fairy tale instead? And you know what, it was great. I really enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to seeing some more of that. From the director of such
happy endings as Pulp Fiction and Reservoir Dogs.
Yeah, right.
So but yeah, go check out our bonus podcast episode that me and Hayden recorded about Once Upon a Time in Hollywood to hear more. And now that we've turned this episode into old Hollywood compared to current Hollywood, let's move on to our next film. Let's bring the podcast into the talking era, shall we?
All right, Coquette. Jason, take it away.
Coquette from 1929. After years of lightly flirting with a series of men in her social circle, Norma Besant learns that Michael Jeffrey has real feelings for her that he's willing to get in a fight over. But more than that, she realizes she has feelings for him as well. The only two things that stand in their way are Michael's lack of work and the disapproval of Norma's father. Michael promises to go off and work for 6 months to make enough money to buy a house and get married, but returns after only 3 to spend a night catching up with Norma in his mother's secluded cabin. Unfortunately, someone else from the small town sees them go to the cabin alone together and quickly spreads the news. When word reaches Norma's father, drastic consequences ensue.
All right, Alex. Coquette is starkly different from both of our previous films in many, many ways. Not only
I was just
because
thinking
it's a
that
talking
it wasn't
picture.
good.
Yeah, no, in the fact that it's bad, in the fact that it's talking, in the fact that it's shot blandly, in the fact that it has a very, very sad ending. There's like so many like in the 3 years between Sparrows and Coquette, like some major stuff happened. I don't know what it was, but this is a different era in the 3 years.
Yeah, no, it's a weird one, and it's weird for a lot of reasons. And I think those are the most.
Play her age though, which is nice.
Yeah, she kind of plays her age. She's kind of like supposed to be like an ingenue, like a young girl who is just quote unquote. The term used to be like coming out in the sense of like a young girl who's now old enough to be like courting and stuff, and now it means something totally different. But
I'm not sure.
Around the age of like 18 or 20, and I think she's that young. That makes sense in the context of this movie.
But I will say that the film starts assuming that she's already been in the social world for a while, and she has been playing the coquette, because the film starts with the scene where she decides not to be a coquette anymore, and so we have to assume that she's not brand new to the social world, but she's been flirting around for a little while, maybe a year or two.
Yeah, what's a coquette, Jonathan?
A coquette is a flirt, is someone who plays with men's emotions. It's pretty much exclusively used for female.
Here I was thinking that it was a like French pastry.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds about right, but no, it's just a flirt, basically. So there you go.
There you go. Now you know. Yeah. No, I mean, so I think the biggest story with this movie that we have to talk about is just the drastic change in Mary Pickford's persona, right? Because at this point, she spent like almost more than 10 years playing the little girl. Pretty much.
Not exclusively, but primarily.
That's her primary identifier. And even going back to like the really early days, like by 1912, she was already known as the girl with the golden curls. Her hair was one of her signatures, right? And then here she comes along and chops it all off. And
she's got the flapper thing going on.
She's got a flapper thing going on, and she's talking now. And those are 3 big changes, and that's a lot to ask for an audience who's garnered so much sympathy for somebody else.
You shouldn't have come. Not quite Singing in the Rain levels.
I don't think her acting is bad in this.
It's theatrical.
It's super theatrical. It's super over the top. And
she's not the worst actor in this movie. There are some bad performances in this movie.
There are when sound came along, Hollywood looked to Broadway to learn how to adapt, and part of that was that they took in a bunch of acting coaches and what's the term I'm thinking? Dialogue coaches. To teach silent actors how to act. And so you get a lot of that over-the-topness coming through here. And you can see her in this movie even doing some of the gestures that she used to do as a silent actor, like how she, at one point, she like puts her finger to her lips very dramatically. And it just, in this context of a sound film, it's just too much.
It became this thing where there was like, every time she said the word adorable, it was like a tick. It was like a very specific choice. Every time she said the word adorable, she would put her hand to her mouth in like this cutesy kind of thing. But it became so predictable and it felt unreal. It didn't feel natural.
Yeah.
So,
and part of it is
because
because
awkward.
Silent film acting is acting in a realm of unrealness, in a realm of a dreamlike quality, in a world that seems like a fantasy in and of itself, because it's inherently fundamentally different from real life because it's silent and without color. And so gestures like that work there, both because you need to do a little more to get stuff to come across, and because
the repetition works because you associate it visually.
It's how you develop a character in a silent in the silent world. But now that you don't need that, sound film is kind of like a fundamentally different medium in a lot of ways. It just feels over the top. It feels unnecessary. And so you kind of lose sympathy for the character Mary Pickford is playing. And in fact, I kind of felt like this movie would have done a little better if her stage name for this movie wasn't Mary Pickford. Like if you had somehow known, or if they had somehow just not had her name associated with it. Like, one, I don't think anybody would have recognized her because she looks so different.
Yeah. So you think she should have like created a new persona for the sound era, or just specifically for this film?
So I think for this film to work, that's what would have happened. That's what would have had to have happened.
But just create a distinction in the career.
Yeah. But I feel like the better way for her to have adjusted was to not change everything at once. I think she did it too drastically. I think she could have done like the same role she had done before, but with sound, and then maybe done a slightly older role and a slightly older role, and then maybe change the hair, and then kind of do it in baby steps.
And gradually go from comedies into tragedies, because this isn't just a drama. This is a full-blown tragedy. So I feel like we should talk about the story of this film, which is going to be the most painful part.
Okay, go for
Alex,
it.
what do you think about the story of this film?
It was dumb and like really, really basic.
Yeah, it was so angsty. There was so much, and I mean, I get it. So the thing is, like, there's a whole kind of genre of literature that is this kind of Southern angsty, honor-based stories. I mean, you think Tennessee William, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, and some of the stuff William Faulkner did, and even Mark Twain and Flannery O'Connor. But this is like that, but taken to a really simple place and then overblown dramatically. Like, the performances were so over the top, all of them. And there were characters that were completely unnecessary. Like, the brother was the dumbest character I've ever seen, maybe.
Oh, gosh. Even just, like, what he was wearing in, like, that first scene.
Yeah.
It was just,
and
was
every
so
time
bad.
he goes, I want a girl who, and then everyone cuts him off, and it's supposed to be funny, but it's just annoying. And the worst part, though, and I'm not going to worry about spoilers for this film, if you can find it, which, good luck. This is actually a pretty difficult film to find a good copy of.
It's on YouTube.
It is on
There's
YouTube.
not a good copy on YouTube.
Not very well.
In fact, there's going to be fewer stills from this movie than normal just because they're bad.
Did yours have Spanish subtitles on it?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so there's that. So, yeah, after the dad kills her boyfriend and they're waiting for the trial, the brother goes, "Why are you still mad at father?" And I nearly turned the movie off. Like, I was like, what? What are you talking about? This... Oh, boy. But I will say, it kept taking left turns. Like, after that, when the boyfriend died, and then all this stuff kept happening. And I was like, what? It's still going? And they're still, like, making these really stupid decisions. And then, like, it fakes this kind of, like, taking the moral high ground over and over and over again, where it's like, I'm not going to betray the guy that I loved because he was innocent, even if my father, is going to die for it. And then she ends up betraying him on the stand. And then the father's like, I was right or whatever. And then he's like, oh, no, I wasn't. Don't sacrifice yourself or your honor for me. And then he commits suicide, which, again, like, I'm not saving any spoilers for this movie. And then that feels like he's just betrayed his honor. And I was just like, everything that everyone was trying to go for gets, like, destroyed and torn down by themselves. And I had no sympathy for anyone by the end of this movie.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I mean, look, I couldn't remember what this movie was about. And then Jonathan just told me again. And now I still can't remember what this movie was about.
Yeah. So this movie is different than the other two, as we've established.
All right, let's go to overall notes.
Wait. Okay, let's
go to overall notes.
We gotta say that Mary Pickford won an Oscar for this film.
I mean, she did, but it was like that Oscar where, that person probably deserves an Oscar, but like maybe you just haven't given it to them yet. So you're like, hey, they did a movie this year, let's give them an Oscar.
Kind of, but also this is the
DiCaprio
second
won for The Revenant.
That's true, but this is also the second Oscar ceremony ever, so it might just be because she's a big deal, not necessarily because she's been waiting a long time for it, because this didn't exist before. So, yes, Mary Pickford won the award, but everyone was overacting, and it doesn't really mean anything in the second Academy Awards ever. There you go. All right, so skipping over Coquette, let's go to overall notes, Alex.
Yeah. Okay, overall notes.
What have we not hit yet? We've hit almost everything.
Well, we talked about how she's really good at physical comedy, which is something you don't really think about, because when you think of silent films, you think of physical comedy, you think of Charlie Chaplin. And I think that might be the most interesting place to pin our overall discussion, Jonathan, because when you think of silent movies, you think of Charlie Chaplin, right? Like, and if you ask somebody on the street to name like a silent film star, they are probably going to say Charlie Chaplin. They might know another one. If they know another one, they're probably going to say Buster Keaton. Maybe Mary Pickford. Maybe. I think there are some people who voted in our poll this weekend who didn't know who Mary Pickford was. They know now. But,
and that's what we're here for.
She kind of has faded from the popular conscious, even though she's had such a big impact on what Hollywood is, because she helped make it and make so much about it. But why does Chaplin hold up so well and Pickford doesn't? Well, I think I have a bit of an answer. And obviously it's multifaceted. I think there's a lot of reasons for it. Obviously, Chaplin was more famous worldwide. He played to the common man. Rather, that was his persona. And so, obviously you can throw down a lot of roots worldwide with that, and it persists over the decades pretty easily. Whereas Mary Pickford's persona, a little girl, often a rich little girl or a spoiled little girl, doesn't have those same kind of legs. Also, it was an idea of what a female star was for Mary Pickford's time was something very anchored in what like Americans wanted out of women at the time, right? Like what the patriarchy wanted out of women at the time. In a sense, this is like, what makes a woman desirable? Being spunky, yes, but also being somebody you need to take care of, somebody who you can shelter and foster, very much like a little girl. And it's a little weird in that way, but the severity, the intensity of her popularity And the fact that she was able to run with that for like 10 plus years shows that it had legs and it had roots. Now, she wasn't the only type of female celebrity at the time. Obviously, there are other ideas of what femininity and desirability as a woman meant in America at the time. But the fact that she lasted so long was probably pretty pinned to that idea of femininity in America in the 19-teens and the 1920s. Now, that is something that has obviously changed, and has changed very drastically from decade to decade and year to year. By the 30s, it was something different. By the 40s, it was something completely different. And you tend to see female stars in those early decades kind of have to either roll with it or fail to roll with the changing ideas. And you see that in Coquette. You see Mary Pickford try to roll with it, but just doesn't work. She can't roll with the changing idea. And that's probably because the inherent parts of her personality that give her star power are more tied to the idea of her little girl persona than they are tied to the idea of a coquette or a flirty young woman persona who has like flapper ideas and freedom ideas tied into her. So the changing of the time quickly erased what made her valuable to the American public as a star. Whereas for Chaplin, even though he himself went on to become a very controversial figure in the next few decades, his idea of the everyman, the person down on their luck, is rather persistent and pretty stable over the long run. Like, there's always going to be somebody who's down and out, right? There's always going to be the tramps in the world, regardless of what society looks like 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, assuming we haven't all destroyed ourselves by then. That's always going to be something that's around. Whereas that idea of femininity that Mary Pickford embraced and kind of helped rise to stardom on faded pretty quickly. Now, it might come back in vogue later on. That stuff happens all the time. And when it does, those stars who are around the first time that thing was in vogue tend to see a bit of a resurgence in popularity. Now, of course, it doesn't help that she's, dead. But her work is still out there and it's still pretty fundamental. And for anybody who's a serious student of film or even just a diehard film buff, I recommend giving it a look and exploring not only through the lens of seeing some interesting early work, but seeing an opportunity into what America and Hollywood and the entertainment industry and what social values were in early 20th century America, and seeing how it helped create the Hollywood industry.
Yeah, I'd like to put just kind of like another angle on that, because I think that, when you think of popular silent film actors that still hold up and still capture the public imagination, you think of Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, Harold Lloyd, Douglas Fairbanks, and maybe Mary Pickford, if you know enough. Can you think of any others that the general public would kind of know by name, Alex?
Possibly Rudolph Valentino, because he died tragically young.
Okay. But of the ones that I named, and all the men specifically, Chaplin, Keaton, Lloyd, and Fairbanks, I think one thing that they have in common is the fact that their films and their physical comedy border on like the area of like circus. Like the fact that their physical prowess is showed off in these things kind of puts another kind of vaudeville spin on them, to the fact where like maybe Fairbanks, but like there are not a lot of men actors even who just did kind of more theatrical dramatic roles in films that were more narrative than vignette, like Chaplin films and stuff, where they're falling around, they're doing all these what would become cartoonish type stunts. You don't know a lot of those in the same way that we don't know the names of a lot of theater actors for most of history, even though we know that theater actors are very important and they keep stories around that we've known forever, like to Shakespeare, to the Greeks, And so I don't know that that's like a huge thing, but the fact that, their performances have this other angle of being this spectacle rather than solely driven by dramatic capability is another thing. And the fact that Mary Pickford can keep up with him to some extent, with her fame through almost exclusively. She does do some physical comedy, not necessarily to the extent that Chaplin and Keaton and Lloyd did, but most of her career was through those dramatic things. And the fact that she, her name keeps up with them, even if in the public consciousness it's more towards the back end of that list, I think is still really, really impressive.
Oh, yeah, of course. Of course. I mean, it feels like an underappreciated segment of entertainment history, especially considering that so much of it is out there, like, available for free.
Seriously.
Yeah, no, it's crazy.
Yeah, and if you're following on the bonus podcast, which we'll talk about again at the end, we're watching films from 1919 and seeing how they stack up to modern films, and if we watch some really good films from 1919 and some not so good films from 1919 in various ways, and just the ways that cultural sensibilities have changed and technical sensibilities have changed and all that kind of stuff. And we're going to be talking about another Mary Pickford movie next week that came out in 1919 called The Hoodlum, which probably has the most out of these movies, physical comedy and Chaplin-esque comedy in it. So if you're interested, stick around to hear about how you can get the bonus podcast. But for now, Alex, why don't you set up what we're going to be talking about next time on this podcast?
All right, so next time on the podcast, Jonathan, we're going to be talking about spooky stuff, because it will be the Halloween episode.
Absolutely.
It's going to be like twice as long, because I'll just talk like this the entire time.
And there goes all our listeners.
I can feel Jonathan rolling his eyes right now. We're in different time zones. We're not on like FaceTime or anything either. Like, I can just feel it. All right, but next time, seriously, we're going to be talking about one of the Hollywood kings of horror, John Carpenter, who makes amazing movies. And whenever people ask me, how do I get into older horror? I see older horror films and I think they're ridiculous. I don't find them scary. I'm like, start with John Carpenter. He's amazing. They're not really that old of films,
no, they're not.
But they are older, and there are some really good ones out there, especially if you're looking for one or two movies that aren't super scary but are still pretty
Alex
scary.
doesn't do horror, so this is a big compliment coming from him.
Yeah, I don't do a lot of horror. I don't do a lot of modern horror.
Like jump scary and slashy stuff.
Yeah, anything that's like gory or jumpy, I don't like it. I don't like it, Jonathan. But I do like John Carpenter.
Okay.
In fact, he's one of my favorite filmmakers. But
that's awesome.
We're going to be talking about his whole career, including 2 spooky movies, and then one movie that's like spooky but not, Halloween horror-y. So we're going to be talking about Halloween from 1971. Obviously, we have to talk about Halloween. How can we not talk about Halloween on Halloween? Then we're going to be talking about one of Escape from New York from 1981, which is a movie that holds a special place in my heart for very specific reasons that are very close to my life. And then finally, we're going to be talking about The Thing from 1982, which is a terrifying movie. And it's one of those movies that's terrifying, but I can't stop watching it because it's just so good. It's going to be amazing. So make sure to go watch those. Go watch some other John Carpenters as well, like Carrie. And oh my gosh, I can't remember the name of it, but the one with the car, Christine. Go watch Christine. It's a great horror movie for people who don't like horror movies. It's scary and stuff, but it's not terrifying because it's just a car.
It's a Stephen King novel, right?
I think it is.
Yeah.
But yes, I highly recommend checking it out. He's got a very specific way of making movies that has kind of filtered its way into like modern mid-tier budget TV in a weird way that I see all the time at work. A lot of atmospheric haze and colored light is used, guys. It's some good looking stuff. Go check it out. I'm excited to talk about it on the podcast. I will be wearing a Halloween costume the entire time we record, although you won't be able to see it. I'm sorry.
But patrons may get a special glimpse of that.
Patrons
we'll have
might.
to hold on to that. Speaking of, we have a Patreon and a coffee account if you would like to donate and keep the show going, help us cover some of our overhead. And like I've been talking about, we have a bonus podcast on which we alternate between talking about new movies that are either recently released or new to stream. And then we also talk about films from 100 years ago. But our last Patreon podcast subject was The Dead Don't Die by Jim Jarmusch. So if you're trying to get into the Halloween spirit, that's a great one because it's a zombie movie, zombie and alien. I don't know. It's a whole thing on its own. Go listen to that podcast. And our latest Patreon commentary track for those in the $10 tier is still Inglourious Bastards, which I covered with our good friend Hayden Schaff. And that was a great conversation. So if you would like to subscribe to us, help keep the show going, we really appreciate those of you who are subscribed. But you can go check out those in the podcast notes.
All right. Well, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Garinger.
And I am at the Blue Jay, 1994.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlinks.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya. So, Alex, what you're telling me is we're going to do an episode on the Crocodile Hunter movie at some point?
Maybe. We could do, I mean, heck, Crocodile Dundee, Crocodile Hunter. There's got to be one other crocodile-themed movie out there. That's an episode.
Yeah. All right. We'll keep it in mind.
Oh, what was I thinking about? There's a lot of, like, Lake Placid. Lake Placid, Crocodile Hunter, Crocodile Dundee, the Crocodile Sode. There you go.
All right, we'll make it happen.